Welcome back to the Wednesday night Bible study. For some of you, welcome for the first time. We're studying a new year and a new series here. Over the year last year, we've looked at the stories of some big heavyweights from the Old Testament through this virtual Bible study. We looked at Abraham, Elijah, and Joseph. What we're about to embark on is the story of David. David is found, his character is found in 1st and 2nd Samuel in the Old Testament. And I'd have to say he's my favorite. But I probably have said that about Abraham and Elijah and Joseph. I guess they're all my favorites. This is one of my favorites. As we get into the story these next several weeks, just like the other stories, I think we can benefit by studying David and his life. As we read about how God interacts with David, we can learn more about God. We can learn more about how God interacts with us humans. And we can learn how we can and should respond to him. And we can get a good model or example of what it means to be a person of faith. There's a lot we can apply in David's life to our lives. So what comes to mind when you think of the Old Testament David? Have any of you just shouted out that he was a king? Yes, he was a great king. What might come to mind is that he was a giant slayer, David and Goliath. He was the one who with the slingshot killed Goliath. And yes, he was a boy at the time. He was a shepherd during that time. And in fact, he was a shepherd when he was anointed as king. He didn't take that throne until he was much older. You may think that he was about the fact he was a personal musician to King Saul. That he was the composer of psalms. My lovely bride just arrived home. Composer of psalms. He wrote many or most of the psalms in the Old Testament. He was a warrior. Unlike his son, King Solomon, who was the king of peace, King David spent a lot of his life and his time as king in war. It may come to mind that he was imperfect, that he had that affair with Bathsheba. You can think of him as an ancestor of Jesus. And one thing that is good to think about David, something that God said himself, was that he was a man after God's own heart. And we'll talk about that in a bit. I think it's valuable to get a little Jewish history to get started. For generations before David, Israel was ruled by judges. There were no kings. The judges were God's spokesmen, and they ruled the Israelites. But 40 years before David assumed the throne as king, the period of the judges came to an end. The prophet Samuel, who's the writer of these two books, 1st and 2nd Samuel, who was also Israel's last judge, had grown old. And normally the leadership would pass to his sons. As it says in 1 Samuel chapter 8, verse 1, when Samuel grew old, he appointed his sons as judges for Israel. The name of his firstborn was Joel, and the name of his second was Abijah, and they served at Beersheba. But his sons were not good. His sons did not walk in his ways, it says in verse 3. They turned aside after dishonest gain and accepted bribes and perverted justice. So the people were dissatisfied with God's system of judges. So they decide they want a king, like their neighbors. So they approached Samuel and asked for a king, or really make a demand. In verse 4, so all the elders of Israel gathered together and came to Samuel at Ramah. They said to him, you are old and your sons do not walk in your ways. Now appoint a king to lead us. Some translate it as judge us, such as all the other nations have. Other nations had kings, heroic men riding a white horse and fighting their battles, protecting them, looking out for their interests, someone in whom they could place their trust. In other words, someone other than God. And what was Samuel's reaction? It says in verse 6, but when they said, give us a king to lead us, this displeased Samuel. So he prayed to the Lord. So Samuel had just spent a lifetime ministering to the Israelites. And what had it produced? Apparently, what it hadn't produced was faith in God. So you can't blame Samuel for being displeased. And no doubt he's feeling responsible. And what does it say Samuel did? He prayed. And he heard from the Lord in verse 7. And the Lord told him, listen to all that the people are saying to you. It is not you they have rejected, but they have rejected me as their king. As they have done from the day I brought them up out of Egypt until this day, forsaking me and serving other gods, so they are doing to you. Now listen to them, but warn them solemnly, and let them know what the king who will reign over them will do. So human desires are not always God's, are they? In the next verses of this chapter, Samuel does warn them, essentially that their desire would come at the high cost of their freedom. If we jump ahead and the people react, and this is what they say in verse 19. But the people refused to listen to Samuel. No, they said, we want a king over us. Then we will be like all the other nations with a king to lead us and to go out before us and fight our battles. When Samuel heard all that the people said, he repeated it before the Lord. The Lord answered, listen to them and give them a king. And that's what happened. A man named Saul is anointed king. Someone who looked good in the Israelites' eyes. He's described in 1 Samuel chapter 9, verse 2. I think I have a slide for that. An impressive man without equal, a head taller than any of the others. He was 30 years old. So I don't want to focus on Saul, the first king, but he starts out a good king and then turns bad. Now, from baseball, you hear about 3 strikes and you're out. Saul struck out with God through 3 acts of disobedience. You can get the details from chapters 13, 14, and 15 in 1 Samuel. His first offense, found in chapter 13, where Saul offered a sacrifice, a duty only for the priests, something Saul knew very well, he was disobeying, was the beginning of the end of Saul's reign. That's when Samuel said Saul would lose his kingship. Let's read what Samuel says to King Saul, 1 Samuel 13, 14. You acted foolishly, Samuel said. You have not kept the command the Lord your God gave you. If you had, he would have established your kingdom over Israel for all time. But now your kingdom will not endure. The Lord has sought out a man after his own heart and appointed him leader of his people because you have not kept the Lord's command. So Saul's goose was cooked. Saul might have some time left as king, but it was borrowed time. And it won't be Saul's only act of obedience either. God has a replacement, and this time the new king would be God's choice. A choice based not on human reason, instead a man after God's own heart. So what do you suppose that means, a man after God's own heart? Here's my take on that, what it means. Living in harmony with God, being concerned about what God is concerned about, obeying his commands, having a heart that's completely his. So after reading chapters 14 and 15 on your own, you'll discover Saul messed up a couple more times, not following the Lord's wishes. I want to have us read the conversation between Samuel and Saul in chapter 15, verse 24. Then Saul said to Samuel, I have sinned. I violated the Lord's command and your instructions. I was afraid of the people, and so I gave in to them. Now I beg you, forgive my sin and come back with me so that I may worship the Lord. But Samuel said to him, I will not go back with you. You have rejected the word of the Lord, and the Lord has rejected you as king over Israel. This was Saul's third strike. I wonder if until then, if Saul had changed his ways, would there have been a different outcome? Was there a chance he could have kept the throne? Let's continue those verses where Samuel has more to say. In verse 27, As Samuel turned to leave, Saul caught hold of the hem of his robe, and it tore. Samuel said to him, "The Lord has torn the kingdom of Israel from you today, and has given it to one of your neighbors, to one better than you. He who is the glory of Israel does not lie or change his mind, for he is not a man that he should change his mind." God is not a being who changes his mind. So Samuel and the king part ways. In verse 35, until the day Samuel died, he did not go to see Saul again, though Samuel mourned for him. And the Lord was grieved that he had made Saul king over Israel. Then God gave Samuel a little push out of his funk. In verse 1 through 4 of chapter 16, the Lord said to Samuel, "How long will you mourn for Saul, since I have rejected him as king over Israel? Fill your horn with oil and be on your way. I am sending you to Jesse of Bethlehem. I have chosen one of his sons to be king." But Samuel said, "How can I go? Saul will hear about it and kill me." So it sounds like Samuel wasn't just being paranoid. This seemed like a legitimate outcome if Saul got wise to God's plan. The Lord said, "Take a heifer with you and say, 'I have come to sacrifice to the Lord.' Invite Jesse to the sacrifice, and I will show you what to do. You are to anoint for me the one I indicate." Samuel did what the Lord said. So it sounds like a good plan. Wouldn't be attracting any undue attention. So when Samuel arrived at Bethlehem, the elders of the town trembled when they met him. They asked, "Do you come in peace?" Samuel replied, "Yes, in peace. I have come to sacrifice to the Lord. Consecrate yourselves and come to the sacrifice with me." Then he consecrated Jesse and his sons and invited them to the sacrifice. So why are you supposing the people would tremble at the arrival of Samuel? You got to remember, Samuel was the nation's judge and a prophet. Had Samuel come to execute a judgment of God's? Was he bringing some chastisement to them? But he assured them of his peaceful intentions. So a very significant event occurs next, and I'm going to read it without comment. We'll take it up again next week. We are running out of time here. When they arrived, Samuel saw Eliab and thought, "Surely the Lord's anointed stands here before the Lord." But the Lord said to Samuel, "Do not consider his appearance or his height, for I have rejected him. The Lord does not look at the things man looks at. Man looks at the outward appearance, but the Lord looks at the heart." Then Jesse called Abinadab and had him pass in front of Samuel. But Samuel said, "The Lord has not chosen this one either." Jesse then had Shammah pass by. But Samuel said, "Nor has the Lord chosen this one." Jesse had 7 of his sons pass before Samuel, but Samuel said to him, "The Lord has not chosen these." So Samuel asked Jesse, "Are these all the sons you have?" "There's still the youngest," Jesse answered, "but he is tending the sheep." Samuel said, "Send for him. We will not sit down until he arrives." So he sent and had him brought in, and he was ready with a fine appearance and handsome features. Then the Lord said, "Rise and anoint him. He is the one." So Samuel took the horn of oil and anointed him in the presence of his brothers. And from that day on, the Spirit of the Lord came upon David in power. Samuel then went to Ramah. Okay, so we finally get to this young boy, David. The last judge, who's also a prophet, has just anointed this young, handsome teenager to be king over Israel, and with the first king still on the throne, no less. I'm going to stop here. Next time, I want to look at the story of the anointing again. There's some truths about God and us that we can get from the story. So in the meantime, stay safe, and may the Lord be with you.